Hello, Tom. Hello, Elise. How are you both?
I'm
We're
doing
good.
well.
I don't know how Tom is, but I'm good.
Yeah, I can't speak for you either, Elise. I'm extremely well, so
Good.
more than good. So
Good,
Um,
good. It's a
yeah,
happy Friday.
it is a happy Friday, despite the the sort of the continued sort of turmoil going on in the United States,
hmm
where they just can't seem to figure it out. It's pretty scary stuff.
hmm
When you and I saw the statistic this morning that the European Union had 5,000 plus new coronavirus. The States had 77,000. The European Union has three times the population. Go figure that out, right? Go figure it out. I mean, it just tells you the stupidity that's going on in that great land of America. It's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Sort of to that.
Yeah.
Anyway. So, right.
Yes.
On to
So
positive things, right?
positive
Yes.
things about America because it created Alfred Stieglitz, the father of modern photography. So we will be talking about him today and his impact on local art. So I think, just to kind of kick off the conversation, Tom or Elise, if you just want to share a little bit more information about who Stieglitz was and give maybe a little context that then helps us bring it back in to focus specifically on Bermuda.
Okay. Well, I don't think that Elise nor I can go into great depths about Stieglitz because volumes of books have been written about him. But let's put it simply this way. He came from a wealthy Jewish merchant family in Hoboken, New Jersey, went over to Europe as a young man, where pictorialism in photography was rampant. And he kind of rejected pictorialism and came back to the United States and started a photo secession group. And that photo secession group created a publication called Camera Work, which is highly sought after today. It didn't last that long, but from Camera Work, he went in to create Gallery 291, and after 291, another gallery, American Place. So the story for me isn't sort of, Tommy the academic talking about Stieglitz. It's the influence that he had. And when I was studying film and photography at university a long time ago, now thank God the memory's still working, you couldn't help but talk about photography without Stieglitz somewhere in the vernacular of the conversation. So in my mind, there are two people here that were played pivotal roles in it. One was commercial, and that's George Eastman, who invented the box camera, which made every man available to a camera. And then there was the academic end, which was the Stieglitz group, where people were pursuing photography and in sort of the art form, as you would say, where there wasn't a debate whether photography was or was not an art. It was to them an art, full stop, no debate. And so that's what they were kind of pushing forward. And then from there, he branched out into having painters in his stable. And Bermuda, this is, I think, where I'm going with this, is that Bermuda, as a result of Stieglitz, has had access to great European and American painters and photographers who have come to our shores as a result of what Stieglitz was attempting to do in New York. So it's kind of as simple as that. So, I'll turn it over to Elise because, there are lots of painters and stuff, that's her area, that have come to that would not have happened without Stieglitz.
Well, as Tom said, Stieglitz was a mentor to a lot of American artists, and more importantly, I think they were drawn to him because he introduced so many of the European modernists to the United States for the first time, Matisse, et cetera. And of course, they were interested because they had been studying overseas as well. So I think the most definitive imports that we had from the Stieglitz Circle in the beginning were Marsden Hartley and Charles Demuth, and they were the ones that, Marsden Hartley anyway, at Stieglitz' blessing, and I think he actually paid for his trip to Bermuda. Stieglitz was very depressed at the time. Hartley was very depressed at the time. He kind of fluctuated through these terrible depressions and feeling sorry for himself, but he was a genius. And just decided it was time to get away. And I guess through Stieglitz, he was directed to Bermuda and thinking it would be warm and beautiful and sunny. Unfortunately, Hartley didn't quite get it that way. He was bored here. He thought it was pretty. He thought it was the kind of place that people like Charles Sassam, who was an impressionist, well-known painter at the time, would enjoy. But he blended in. He stayed first at the Brunswick Street guest house in Hamilton, and later moved to the St. George's Hotel with his friend Charles Demuth, who came down. And of course, this was in the middle of World War I, and Bermuda was a pretty desolate, bleak place then. But both of them were homosexuals, and they enjoyed being together. I don't know whether anybody has proven that they had a relationship, but it doesn't really matter. But they were became each other's muses down here. And the story goes, and then Albert Gles came down, and after that, of course, Georgia O'Keeffe, being married to Stieglitz, she followed in the 30s, and in between then there were people like Niles Spencer, the precisionist who painted St. George's in such a spectacularly architectural style. Carl Sprickhorn, who was also an artist from Maine, who came down during the war and painted a good number of scenes down here. And the list kind of goes on and on and on. And so I think we can fairly say with a lot of certainty that Bermuda was very influential in the development of American modernism. And that was thanks to Stieglitz. We don't think Stieglitz ever actually came down here himself, but he certainly directed a lot of the artists from his stable to come down here.
Risa, whenever I'm doing a tour, and I do a lot of them, Americans are very familiar with Georgia O'Keeffe. When you say hands up, who's heard of Georgia O'Keeffe, every hand goes up. And then you say, who's heard of Stieglitz? Maybe one goes up in a group of 25, maybe. So the irony is that because of Stieglitz, O'Keeffe was given a platform to express her artwork, and on those shoulders, she leapfrogged into fame, whereas Stieglitz sort of morphed into being almost anonymous to sort of the general public. Again, to the sort of the literary and painterly photography types, Stieglitz is an icon. But to the general public, he's not well known at all. So, the irony sort of lives on in that way. And it was when we discovered that Gles had come to Bermuda and stayed at the Hamilton Hotel, that's when all the bells and whistles went off in my mind because of the Stieglitz connection. And there was sort of that urgency of saying, we have got to have a Cubist work, although Cubism at that time was a little bit, on the late end of the curve in practice. In theory, it was something that still is impactful in our lives, 110 years later. So, it's something that it separates the Bermuda Muse from any other collections, globally. And that's kind of what I love to think about. What makes the collection unique? Well, it makes it's the Stieglitz connection that makes it unique. And I'm pretty proud of all that. I must say.
I think one of the things that always interested me was when the collection started to be built and we realized the Stieglitz collection. And in those days, believe it or not, so many people told us that photography wasn't a fine art form. I mean, why do we have photography in our collection? Why do you have photographs? Why isn't it just painting? And of course, on Tom's knee, I learned a lot about photography and the importance of it. And I don't think even to this day, the impact of somebody like Stieglitz's photography is appreciated the way it should be. I don't think photography period is appreciated the way, a lot of the fine art painters are appreciated. I mean, when you look at his photographs, they are so painterly and so beautiful and so beautifully composed, as was Carl Struss, who came down here. But for some reason, they've always been given short shrift. It's getting better, and people do now understand what the place photography holds in the development of modern art, American art, European art. But honestly, in the early 90s, it was a real battle, wasn't it, Tom?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You know,
And I think coming out of what you both just said, there's 2 points that really interest me. One is that it's one of the few stories I've heard of the male artist, with his photography skill set being overshadowed by his female partner. That usually doesn't really happen if you look at art history as a
That's
whole.
right.
So that's quite an interesting bit of the story, just with Georgia O'Keeffe really taking off and him kind of being put in the shadows. And the second part is just, anybody that knows Stieglitz, thinks of the New York street scenes or Georgia O'Keeffe, being photographed, over 200, 300 times. So it's interesting to think about his direct relationship to Bermuda, because from the outside world, people wouldn't necessarily make that connection.
Oh, no, that's exactly right. And when you read any bios or literature on Stieglitz, Bermuda never gets sort of even as much as a credit. Yet you can be sure he probably pronounced that one word Bermuda more than 100 times because of the entourage that went back and forth and plied the waters to spend some time here. So, not that he, as Elise said, not that there was any urgency that he was going to come to the island. But there certainly was an urgency to get others here to the island because, like Hartley, when O'Keeffe came here, she too was on the depressed side. So Bermuda's colors and its atmosphere and its waters and all the the warm, salubrious tones of the island, got her creative juices going again. So when she headed out west in 1934 after her second visit, she never looked back. And after that, her reputation, her fame, and her legacy was made. She lived on, and it's interesting to see her work prior to Bermuda as opposed to post Bermuda. And it'd be interesting if somebody really picked that up. That's not for me to do. That's for the academic painterly world. I spend my life just fundraising, trying to keep the doors open. So what do I know? I just
yeah. And Stieglitz is he was quite a prolific letter writer. And if you read the volumes that he and Hartley wrote, just between the two of them, he really did, he encouraged and he helped and he talked to and he directed and he gave all these artists who were, as we all know, artists can be really, really insecure about their work and what direction it's moving in. And what he did is he was a guiding light for a lot of these artists who were sort of down in the dumps, or they had hit a sort of a creative wall or whatever. And he really did talk them through the process. And if you read the letters that he writes to artists, even if he didn't think Bermuda was the greatest place in the world, at least he knew it was a place that was, it's why you call it the Bermuda Respite. That's why we call the show on Georgia O'Keeffe. It was a respite. It was a time, it's a place for artists that they could come down here, they could take a break, they could breathe deeply, they could think, and then go back recharged. And I think personally, my own personal opinion is Stieglitz understood the importance of recharging an artist's battery this way. And that to me is one of the reasons why he would encourage people to come to the island.
Mm-hmm. And what the other bit, and I don't know if either of you know this, but I find it interesting that he encouraged all of these artists to come to Bermuda and paint or draw. Do you know if he impacted any photography happening on island, or was it mostly watercolors?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, there was a photographer called Carl Struss, who probably is not as well known as other photographers like Clarence White that were in his entourage. But Struss definitely was influenced by Bermuda. Struss was influenced by Stieglitz, and Struss was also employed by the Trade Development Board. And that would not have again happened. And he left a remarkable body of Bermuda work, the archive of which is out of the Amon Carter Museum. And we actually could do a book out of that. They've given us permission to do a book of his Bermuda work, but it would be an expensive undertaking. But it's a window of Bermuda circa 1912 to 1916. There are about 500 glass plate images out there. And Struss also made the first color images of Bermuda. in 1913. And that was a mere 5 years after the invention of color photography. So that's a, a pretty cool thing to keep in your back pocket as well, because we do have a couple of the images. They're reprints from the originals of the color. But again, it's an insight in color of how people dressed, the colors that they wore. It's a wonderful revelation. So there's a whole body of stuff yet to be fully discovered, and that's for the next generation to sort of pick it up. I mean, that's sort of what Elise and I are trying to do as we exit out the door, is give as much information about what we know so that it is not lost nor forgotten, and that it can get picked up and people can move on with it.
Well, it's funny because yesterday I spent a lot of time with one of my colleagues downstairs going through all boxes and boxes and boxes of tourism brochures. And it struck me how often from sort of 1910 on, the Bermuda Trade Development Board, involved fine artists in promoting Bermuda. I mean, Struss was one, Adolf Treidler, there were all the brochures that you look like, Charles Hawthorne, a lot of the brochures that you look at from that time up through the 20s were all illustrated by fairly well-known artists. So, it wasn't, I don't think we even knew what was going, the influence that was going on, but it's pretty striking. And I think that it's all part of the whole story of Bermuda being a muse for artists, and having people like Stieglitz, who was so important in the New York circles anyway, understand that.
Yeah, certainly, and so interesting that there's no evidence that he actually came here himself, but was supporting artists to actually come here and recharge their batteries. So yeah.
Sometimes I feel that they were such pains in the neck to him. It's like, how am I going to get these guys out of New York so they stop whining to me about money? And, putting them on a boat to Bermuda was cheaper than listening to them. That's my empirical theory.
That might well be it. That might be well, yeah. Okay, so before we wrap up, are there any last thoughts that you want to share about Stieglitz? And, I think you definitely looked at how he brought a number of artists to Bermuda and really was kind of the brainchild behind that movement, shifting to Bermuda. Is there anything else that you think is important for our listeners to know?
The only thing that I think is important is the great education that I got at university from my American professors, albeit the university was in Canada. But the American professors that I learned under were just really significant in their knowledge about Stieglitz and the influence that he had in photography. And I'm just so eternally grateful that I got that grounding in it, because when you sort of stumble on this idea of creating a masterworks thing in 1987, little would you know that your education in the early 70s would be called upon to be given, its full due.
Right. Well, that's a great point, Tom, because I think you can't just plunge into something like the Masterworks collection or any collection. You really do need a background in photography, in fine arts, in American art. And then you start doing, putting the pieces together and you start connecting the dots. I mean, you could do a whole story on not just the artists that came down here, but as we've talked about before, the writers that have come down here, and they weren't in a bubble. They all kind of interacted. The artists and the writers and the musicians, they did interact. And so the picture is a lot more than just a painting on a wall.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the stories behind it. All right, well, thanks, Tom. Thank you, Elise.
You're welcome.
I will see you next week. We'll have another great topic to go through, but appreciate this conversation around Stieglitz and, what he did for the island, and thinking about him as an artist and a photographer outside of his relationship to Georgia O'Keeffe. So I think it's nice to give him a little bit of airtime.
Yeah, that's right. And on a final note on all this, which is important, because Elise has mentioned Hartley. Hartley, because of Glez, and again, indirectly because of Stieglitz, Hartley was the first American to paint a work known as synthetic cubism. And it was called Movement Bermuda, 1917. And so it happens to be a Bermuda subject matter, which is just so relevant to our collection. And again, what makes it unique, that it's just the coolest thing that ever could have happened. It's just so cool. So there you go. Just thought I would mention.
Okay, see you later, guys.
Yes, and we hope everybody will come out and visit us and visit our collection. As Tom said, it is a very unique collection, and we hope people will spend some time over the summer coming in and checking it out. So thank you all, and till next time.